In this video, we will seek to answer a series of claims commonly made by Catholic apologists, specifically Michael Lofton of Reason and Theology, who claim, among other things, that we lack a magisterium, meaning that we supposedly lack the ability to make dogmatic statements on any given issue because we lack a pope. Mr. Lofton makes a series of other claims that we will work our way through during the course of this response. Now, in preparation for this, we listened to nearly 400 episodes of Reason and Theology. It was actually a fairly easy task, as the vast majority of Reason and Theology episodes are excessively repetitive and really a matter of mass quantity at the expense of any quality. In addition, we are sorely aware that Mr. Lofton has, as of yet, refused to engage us by name, but only occasionally making snide remarks and reposting others' comments about us. Aside from dismantling Mr. Lofton's claims and exposing them for their egregious mediocrity, one of our goals in this video is to force Mr. Lofton into responding directly to us, as we know that if we can pull him into an engagement, it will provide further opportunities to demonstrate just how weak, indefensible, and devoid of nuance his arguments are. We also intend to coax Mr. Lofton into a debate. So far, Mr. Lofton has refused our offers for a debate by hiding behind the accusation that we are, quote, uncharitable. But, as a token of charity, we will offer Mr. Lofton the same offer we made Mr. Ibarra and the entire Reason and Theology crew, and that is this. If he is willing to debate us by live stream on any Orthodox channel, we will give him 150% of our time. If this is not enough, we will go above and beyond the offer we presented to Mr. Ibarra, and instead we are willing to give Mr. Lofton 200% of our time. We have yet to see a Catholic apologist who is willing to make such a generous and charitable offer to one of their interlocutors. In fact, what we mostly hear is complaints of lacking charity. Of course, if we were to look up what charity actually means, it essentially means to be gentle and assume the best motives. But in a debate, what does it really matter if your opponent assumes you have the best motive possible? Debates are about content, not about your personal opinion of the other person. The Roman Catholic saint, Robert Bellarmine, was aware of this. Instead of using Luther's obnoxious attitude or King James's murderous ways as excuses not to engage them, Bellarmine was undeterred and wrote against both Luther and King James. He even engaged Calvin. Likewise, the Roman Catholic popes and bishops of the 16th century were so willing to engage Luther, Calvin, King James, and all the other obnoxious reformers to the point that the Council of Trent was held. But what we have found with the vast majority of Catholic apologists is that they are simply unwilling to engage us or our material. All three debates we have had are debates in which we reached out to our interlocutors, and in all three of them we allowed them to speak as long as they would like. In the end, our experience with Catholic apologists is all the Deus vult, until someone's feelings are hurt. For the record, though we are hated almost universally by Catholic apologists, many of whom regularly make all sorts of nasty and false allegations against us, that does not stop us from offering them a debate and, moreover, charitably, offering them 150%, or in this case, even 200% of our time. The reason is, we value content over feelings, and we are confident that, given the chance, we can present the Orthodox Christian case convincingly to the audience. This is one of the reasons why we are so desirous that this video will force Mr. Lofton into responding. We are sure that when he attempts to respond, it will prove, beyond a doubt, that he is unable to provide satisfactory answers to our arguments. But before we continue, we would like to mention our new sponsor, Free Filtering. FreeFiltering.org is a free DNS-based web filtering system designed by a father who wants to make the internet a safer place for souls. Free filtering will help block websites that are devoted to promoting evil. They will help you automatically block roughly 1.8 million pornographic websites already catalogued in their database. They have also built in artificial intelligence that automatically detects if a brand new website is pornographic, so it's blocked before it even loads. If you want to help keep your family safe from predatory internet websites, or if you're a young man who struggles with pornography, help yourself avoid temptations and download free filtering using the referral ID link in the description below. Now, prior to playing each clip, we will state the name of the video and the timestamps for each clip so that, if they so desire, the audience is able to listen to each quotation in its original context and see that we are not taking these out of context, but are providing the most charitable reading of Mr. Lofton's positions. Our first clip comes from the show entitled Why an Eastern Orthodox Became Catholic on the channel Catholic Truth. It runs from minute mark 18 and 25 seconds through 21 minutes and 33 seconds. We have chosen to place this clip first because it is the clearest and most crystallized version of Mr. Lofton's thought, and in a debate we do not desire to straw-man our opponent but to steel-man him. In other words, we want to present his strongest case, and that is why it took us watching nearly 400 episodes of Reason and Theology before we found clips that were not disjointed, rambling, or poorly stated. We wanted to encounter Mr. Lofton's best arguments head-on and dismantle him at his strongest.
So this is why I think actually the Catholic Church is unique. I think that it has a unique claim to authority. So we can speak about 3 to 5 different, criticisms of Orthodoxy, but ultimately they boil down to one, in my opinion.
Sure.
And that is, again, authority. Because if we're going to discuss, okay, well, with some Eastern Orthodox, there's a difference maybe with the filioque, right? That addition to the Nicene Creed that says that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. Some Eastern Orthodox are going to say that's illegal. The Pope can't add that to the creed. Only an ecumenical council could revise it. Or they will, they will also criticize the theology behind the idea that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. So there's one theological issue. We could speak of the filioque. We could even speak of some Eastern Orthodox who deny the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary, and they don't believe that she was born in a state free from original sin. And that's partly because they sometimes understand original sin a little differently than Catholics. All of this really depends on which Orthodox you're talking about, though. Some will accept the filioque theologically. Some will accept the Immaculate Conception. Some will understand original sin in the way that we understand it. So it really depends on who we're talking about. Well, there's about 3 different issues right there. But ultimately, we can take those issues and boil them down to one of authority. Because at the end of the day, we're going to be able to produce different patristic sources for our respective traditions. So ultimately, there's going to have to be some kind of authority that is alive today, that is able to arbitrate with these discussions and offer a authoritative and or definitive answer to these issues. So ultimately, my biggest criticism with Eastern Orthodoxy is it, in my opinion, lacks an objective authority that can arbitrate on matters of faith and morals. Now, we can go into that in more detail, but that's kind of how I would quickly summarize it.
Sure. Did you say some of the Orthodox don't accept Immaculate Conception, meaning like some also do?
Some do,
Okay.
but some don't.
And I guess that comes down to what you're saying with authority is, some do, some don't. Some believe this, some don't. From the outside looking in, it almost seems, and I don't want to insult them because I love my Eastern Orthodox and just Orthodox brothers and sisters in general, but it almost seems like Protestantism to me. I mean, they've already divided into different sects. They can't agree among each other. They disagree with the Catholic Church and protest the church, but then they quickly protest against each other too. And they don't really have that central teaching or central authority that you mentioned. Does that sound accurate?
It's Protestantism with apostolic succession.
Correct.
So it's a bump up. It's a step up. There's a plus there. Most Protestants don't have valid orders with apostolic succession. However, the Eastern Orthodox and also the Oriental Orthodox churches do have valid orders and apostolic succession.
What comes up again and again is Mr. Lofton believes that we are unable to come to an agreement on dogma because we lack a pope. But what he never answers is how all of our patriarchal synods agreeing on a matter of faith does not form a definitive magisterium. If every local synod votes overwhelmingly in favour of a specific creed or statement of faith and thereby adopts it as its own, how would that not be a definitive statement on faith? He never answers this. Now Mr. Lofton would likely glibly respond with something like, "Sure, but you can't even have an ecumenical council. You tried in 2016 and that failed." But if Mr. Lofton takes that angle, he still fails to answer our argument, because an ecumenical council is not the only way to attain agreement among the synods. For example, all Orthodox synods have ratified the Confession of Dositheus, which was promulgated at the Council of Jerusalem in 1672, but it was done at various times, some in 1672, some in 1723. A much more accurate and nuanced argument Mr. Lofton could instead make is that the Orthodox Church has a magisterium, but that it is slow and cautious to formulate dogma. Concerning Mr. Lofton's comments on the Immaculate Conception, it is ironic that he doesn't seem to know what his own dogma is. In the clip, he states that the Immaculate Conception means Mary was born without sin, but that is incorrect, as the dogma states she was conceived without sin. For someone who rambles endlessly on the need for, quote, nuance, one would expect him to be nuanced in the difference between conception and birth. They're about 9 months apart. As we will continually see in this video, as with most persons who continually and publicly decry the lack of a specific characteristic in others, in this case nuance, Mr. Lofton lacks the very characteristic he berates others for not possessing. Mr. Lofton, like most Catholic apologists, is enslaved to the notion that simply because something is a big deal to the Catholic Church, therefore it is a big deal to others, and that our supposed lack of statement on such a supposedly big issue is a sign of failure. In his world of nuance, it never occurs to Mr. Lofton that perhaps the Immaculate Conception isn't a big deal to us, and it requires no official statement. Surely there was no dispute about this within the Catholic Church when the dogma was defined in the 19th century. Now, more accurately, we can say that we do have an official statement on the topic which the Immaculate Conception seeks to answer, and that is contained in the 6th decree of the Confession of Dositheus from the Council of Jerusalem in 1672. It states outright, quote, "We believe the first man created by God to have fallen in paradise, when, disregarding the divine commandment, he yielded to the deceitful counsel of the serpent, and hence hereditary sin flowed into his posteriority, so that none is born after the flesh who beareth not this burden, and experienceth not the fruits thereof in this present world. But by these fruits and this burden we do not understand sin such as impiety, blasphemy, murder, sodomy, adultery, fornication, enmity, and whatsoever else is by our depraved choice committed contrarily to the divine will, not from nature, for many both of the forefathers and of the prophets, and vast numbers of others, as well as those under the shadow, as under the truth, such as the divine precursor, and especially the Mother of God the Word, the ever-Virgin Mary, experienced not these or other such like fruits, but only what the divine justice inflicted upon man as a punishment for the transgression, such as sweats in labour, afflictions, bodily sicknesses, pains in childbearing, and, in fine, while on our pilgrimage, to live a laborious life, and lastly, bodily death. We will continually return to the Confession of Dositheus and its standing in the Orthodox Church throughout this video, but it should be noted that the condemnation of the Immaculate Conception was given outright in the 6th and 13th chapters of the 1895 encyclical issued by a local council in Constantinople. But let us pretend that this decree does not exist, and let us pretend that we have not ruled on it. In that case, if the Orthodox Church is in a state of failure because we supposedly have not ruled on the Immaculate Conception, then the Catholic Church was also in a state of failure for the more than 18 centuries prior to ruling on the Immaculate Conception. If the Orthodox Church decided to rule definitively on the Immaculate Conception in the year 2050 or 2100, what would really be the problem with waiting 200 or 250 more years when the Catholic Church had, according to its own narrative, waited more than 1800 years? Even if we were to relegate it to the time roughly around Bernard of Clairvaux, speaking against it in the mid-12th century, or to the time of Aquinas, who rejected it in the 13th century, it would still mean the Roman Catholic Church had been in a state of failure for 5 to 6 centuries, as they had failed to rule on it. The issue is that in Mr. Lofton's mind, and this is true of most Catholic apologists, no other church is their own entity. Rather, everyone else simply reacts to the Catholic Church. In other words, when the Catholic Church rules on something, everyone else must suddenly scramble to come up with a comparable ruling in reaction to the Catholic decision. But we are our own people and our own church, and we do not live in reaction to the Catholic Church, nor should we. But in this case, it turns out that we had actually ruled on the topic centuries before the Catholic Church. But if we were to turn this on the Catholic apologists and point out that the Catholic Church has no official position on the essence-energies distinction versus absolute divine simplicity, they would simply state that the Roman Catholic Church allows a plurality of views because this is not a particularly important issue. If we pressed it and argued that they are behind and ineffective because we ruled on the essence-energies distinction close to 7 centuries ago, their response would be along the lines that the Orthodox Church has unnecessarily limited its worldview in the defining of dogma in these instances, or simply repeat that the issue of Palamism versus Thomism versus Scotism is a non-issue Catholics are supposedly allowed to hold either position on. But when the Catholic Church has ruled that mutually contradictory schools of thought are acceptable, how is this any more of a solution than simply reducing it to a theologumenon, or theological opinion, in much the same way we're accused of treating the Immaculate Conception? In short, when the Catholic Church is ambiguous and has failed in defining dogma, Mr. Lofton gives it a free pass, but when we are ambiguous, he treats it as a failure of our ecclesiology. This is called a double standard, and is blatant hypocrisy. Now, the interviewer does it, and Lofton then seconds him on it. He attempts to poison the well by comparing the Orthodox Church to what Catholics hate most, Protestantism. Catholics look down their noses at Protestants, and for good reason, but in comparing us to what is rightfully a collection of overtly, overly emotional dogmaless fiefdoms, and oftentimes cults across the border in Germania, the narrator is attempting not to argue a point, but to use guilt by association, which is a logical fallacy. This would be bad enough, but considering it comes at the end of a list of straw men, it makes it even more egregious. Our next clip is from the same show and takes place at minute marks 21 and 44 seconds through 23 minutes and 42 seconds, and here Mr. Lofton makes many of the same assertions as in our previous clip.
If we're going to ask, okay, well, what exactly is the official Eastern Orthodox perspective on the Immaculate Conception? Well, there isn't one. Okay, well, how do we determine whether it's true or not? Well, some will suggest an ecumenical council is able to arbitrate between these disputes. But then there's quite a few problems that we're going to run up against when it comes to Eastern Orthodoxy and ecumenical councils. Number one, what is an ecumenical council according to Eastern Orthodoxy? How do you identify what is an ecumenical council versus what is a fake council, or maybe just a local council or a regional council or something like that? And then number two, who gets to call the ecumenical council? In the first millennium, it was generally the emperor who called the ecumenical councils. Well, we don't have an emperor anymore. So what do we do now? This is why there's generally no unanimity here on who can call an ecumenical council. In fact, there's a major schism going on right now in Eastern Orthodoxy between the See of Constantinople and the See of Moscow, and it's affecting other sees in the Eastern Orthodox communion as well. And the issue really boils down to one of authority in Eastern Orthodoxy. What role of authority does the Patriarch of Constantinople have as first among equals? Does he have the authority to grant autocephaly to the Ukrainian church? Does he have the authority to call an ecumenical council? These are issues that really are at the root of the current schism inside the Eastern Orthodox churches. So it's a pretty big issue, and I would say it's one that has massive implications as we see today. There is a schism going on because there is not a consistent understanding of authority.
Notice there is no citation nor any reference to any formal documents anywhere in this clip. One would think that having had so many shows on this very topic, Mr. Lofton would be prepared and perhaps have a handful of quotations on hand, but he does not present any at all. Further, Mr. Lofton assumes ecumenical simply means dogmatically binding, but for us the difference between an ecumenical and pan-Orthodox council is simply a matter of who was bankrolling it. When the emperor bankrolled it and issued the summons, it was called ecumenical. When it is called by the ecumenical patriarch, it is generally called pan-Orthodox. Regardless of what they are called, when all of the synods accept the decision of a council and make it their own, it is then by default dogmatically binding for the Church. Councils that are not accepted by all of the patriarchates are not actually pan-Orthodox. Such is the state that the Council of Crete in 2016 is now in. Now, in the Seventh Ecumenical Council, it is stated blatantly in the Horace what makes a council binding, or, as Mr. Lofton states, ecumenical, and that is its acceptance by all the patriarchal synods. One might try to brush this aside, but we have two collections of quotations from Church Fathers, each known as a Florilegium, on this very topic on our blog entitled What Makes a Council Ecumenical. Furthermore, at the Council of Crete in 2016, the Ecumenical Patriarchate was pushing for the attendance and acceptance of the Council by all of the synods, specifically because there would be no denying the Council later on if it had been accepted by everyone. And so we see again, Mr. Lofton does not answer how the acceptance of a council or creedal statement by all of the churches is not a definitive magisterium. Mr. Lofton also claims that there is a question as to who is allowed to call an ecumenical council, but this is patently false. Case in point, despite all of Russia's peacocking and boisterous behaviour, it would not even summon the 2020 gathering in Amman, Jordan, that it requested in protest to the Council of Crete. Rather, it asked the Patriarchate of Jerusalem to call it. One might point out that this is because it was held in the territory of the Patriarchate of Jerusalem, but the question is, why didn't Russia simply call and hold it in a territory of Russia? The answer is that it couldn't, because it lacks the canonical prerogatives. Furthermore, the gathering in Amman was not styled an ecumenical council or pan-Orthodox council, but simply a fraternal gathering, which explains why Jerusalem wasn't actually able to call it, but simply opened a venue for others to join. Historically, ecumenical councils have been called by the emperor since they were willing to bankroll it. Only in one case, that of the Seventh Council, was it claimed that the Patriarch of Constantinople summoned it, and that was a poorly constructed facade attempting to hide the pro-iconodule imperial agenda. None of the ecumenical councils of the undivided Church were directly called or summoned by a pope. In fact, the one council that attempted to be ecumenical and was called by a pope, Lateran of 649, was tacitly ignored at the Sixth Ecumenical Council and is not only not considered ecumenical by Catholics today, but never has been. But Mr. Lofton claims that the ability to call an ecumenical council and grant autocephaly are the issues that have caused this most recent schism between Moscow and Constantinople, but he is again wrong. As we have just discussed, they both agree on who can call a council. Moreover, in the official documents released, they both more or less agree on who can grant autocephaly, the Mother Church whose decision is then ratified by the other patriarchates. In other words, they both agree it is a church-wide issue that is initiated by the Mother Church. The issue is that Constantinople and Moscow disagree on who is the Mother Church for the Ukrainians, with both patriarchates claiming it as their own. Mr. Lofton also makes the bizarre claim that, quote, there is not a consistent understanding of authority and primacy and councils in Eastern Orthodoxy, end quote. But we have numerous canons outlining what primacy is, and we go over those for roughly the first hour of our very first video from May 2020. Furthermore, in our video against the Trailestory from March 2021, and in our 2 Florilegiums, we clearly present the case of the Orthodox Church, namely that binding councils are those which are accepted by all of the patriarchal synods. But again, Mr. Lofton refuses to engage this, and the reason is almost certainly because it would collapse his main argument against us, and if he can present us as a doctrinal free-for-all, he can semi-successfully stoke the fears of angst-ridden Catholics of the conservative and rad-trad strains, as if to say, if you go east, you'll lack clarity of dogma, you won't know exactly what to think, and you'll be anxious all the time. Our third clip comes from the same show, Why an Eastern Orthodox Became Catholic, on the channel Catholic Truth. The quotations come from minute mark 25 and 58 seconds through 26 minutes and 46 seconds.
And in fact, there are Eastern Orthodox who are saying, look, the only way that this is going to be resolved is through a universal council. The problem is they can't identify what one is. They recently tried to have what's called a Great and Holy Council. They don't call it an Ecumenical Council because they don't have an emperor, but it's effectively the equivalent. They had been preparing this thing for over 100 years and finally got to have it in 2016. And guess what? Because of issues between Moscow and Constantinople, Moscow doesn't show up. And so that led to a chain of events that eventually made the entire Great and Holy Council of 2016 a dud. And it just it belly flopped and it did nothing.
That is not actually why Moscow did not show up. A simple internet search reveals that Moscow's official reasoning was that it would attend the council only if it were pan-Orthodox, and as Antioch was in a 3-year-long territorial dispute with Jerusalem over the nation of Qatar, Antioch refused to attend. Prior to that, the Patriarchate of Bulgaria refused to attend because it incorrectly thought that the documents presented and agreed upon in the previous meetings over the years were not open to discussion and amendment. In reality, the documents were discussed at length and even amended at points, such as what was meant by the term church when it was used to speak of Christians outside the Orthodox Church. Georgia withdrew due to a need for more time to review the documents, and so, due to the non-attendance of Antioch, Bulgaria and Georgia, Russia then withdrew. That is their official reasoning. It is telling that in Moscow's various official statements since announcing their withdrawal, their stated reasoning for not coming to the council outright admits we have a standard of what makes a council pan-Orthodox, that all of the Church are present and agree on the creedal formulas. A more clear-cut example of how we are indeed capable of gathering together to solve issues came in 1998, when the Ecumenical Patriarchate called a pan-Orthodox council to solve the issue of the schism in the Bulgarian Church. 13 days after he called the council, representatives of every single Orthodox church arrived in Sofia, and over the course of 2 days, they unanimously agreed on who the rightful Patriarch of Bulgaria was. The fourth clip is from the same show that the previous 3 clips are from, but at minute marks 12 and 8 seconds through 13 minutes and 2 seconds.
Boom. There was quite a few churches that didn't receive the Council of Chalcedon. So who has to receive it is the first question. And then how long does this reception need to be? How long do we need before we know it's been properly received? There aren't any objective answers here, not any ones that are satisfactory. Whereas the Catholic Church does offer a definitive, an objective answer here on how to determine what is an ecumenical council or what is a definitive statement. And it's especially in the papacy, right? The papacy is able to ratify certain councils as ecumenical. And so that's how you identify what an ecumenical council is. And of course, the papacy is also able to definitively define or propose matters of faith and morals itself. So there's an objective way to identify those kinds of ex cathedra statements.
Mr. Lofton's comments about Chalcedon are patently false, and had he read the Acts of Chalcedon, he would have known. But instead he goes with the mythology surrounding the council, and not the actual primary source documents. The Patriarch of Alexandria, Dioscorus, was deposed at Chalcedon, and the official letter of deposition at the end of the third session clearly stated that it was due to receiving into communion those who had been lawfully deposed by a local council and to refusing the 3 summons to the council, which is a reference to Canon 74 of the Apostolic Canons. The letters make no mention of heresy. With Dioscorus deposed for refusing the 3 summons, the Council of Chalcedon issued Canon 30, which stated that the Egyptian bishops could wait to vote on the tome of St. Leo until a new Patriarch of Alexandria could be elected. Saint Proterius was elected to take the place of Dioscorus, and Saint Proterius, along with his Alexandrian bishops, signed the decrees of Chalcedon. He was later martyred in 457 for his firm adherence to Chalcedon. The signatures of the Patriarch of Antioch, Maximus, and the Antiochian bishops are recorded in the Acts of Chalcedon, as are those of Juvenal of Jerusalem and his bishops. What did occur, though is later on, parallel hierarchies were created by dissenters, but this took place mostly in the 6th century, most notably under Jacob Bar Adeus in Syria, who ordained literally thousands of bishops, priests and deacons, thereby establishing a parallel anti-Chalcedonian hierarchy. A similar move occurred in Egypt, but earlier. The only reason Jacob Bar Adeus had to do mass ordinations was because while monophysitism became popular amongst the laity in rural areas, specifically in Egypt and Syria, and despite that it eventually found a stronghold in disproportionately large amounts of monastic centres, with relatively few exceptions, the episcopate immediately accepted Chalcedon throughout the empire. Therefore, monophysite laity were left largely without clergy, and hence the nickname Akephali, or headless ones, as they mostly lacked bishops until the eve of the Islamic conquests. This small presence of monophysites among the episcopae becomes exceptionally clear when one reads the ecclesiastical history of the monophysite bishop John of Ephesus. What Mr. Lofton should have argued was that decades after the council closed, a substantial minority of bishops, while not rejecting Chalcedon, were occasionally soft to it, which led to failed attempts at union, such as the Henoticon. In the end, though, Mr. Lofton's assertion that many of the existing churches did not receive Chalcedon is historically illiterate. In the following clip, from the show Why I Chose Catholicism Over Eastern Orthodoxy, on the channel Pints with Aquinas, Mr. Lofton claims that anyone who dissents from the Catholic Church's teaching is a dissenter, but he is clear that he considers that impossible in the Orthodox Church because, according to him, there is no such thing as the ability to create an official position by the Orthodox Church. This clip is from Mark 1 hour 34 and 38 seconds to 1 hour 35 minutes and 13 seconds.
One, we have an objective magisterium that is able to settle points of dispute. They don't. So that's one of my concerns. Number two, whenever you have somebody in the Catholic Church that is in dissent, they're just that. They're dissenting from what the magisterium has taught. Whereas in Eastern Orthodoxy, when you have these disputes, they're having these disputes sometimes because there is no teaching authority on the matter. So they are able to dispute things like the Filioque or the Immaculate Conception. So there's a fundamental difference there.
Yeah.
The problem with Mr. Lofton's argument is his assumption behind what constitutes an actual teaching organ. For example, when all of our synods agree on a certain statement of faith as being an accurate description of the Orthodox faith, how is that not the Orthodox Church teaching definitively on a matter of dogma? Such a situation has occurred with the Palamite councils in the mid-14th century, the Council of Jassy in 1642, and the Confession of Dositheus, ratified by the Council of Jerusalem in 1672. Now Mr. Lofton might very well respond with, "But how do you know it is being exercised?" And the answer is obvious. All of our synods have accepted it. This is no different than the Roman Catholic theory behind an ecumenical council. The bishops gather, they vote, and once an overwhelming majority has been reached, the Pope ratifies the consensus, and the proposals become dogma. The only difference is that in our system, the Ecumenical Patriarch ratifies the votes, and there is no backdoor method of the Pope attaining what he wants via an exercise of papal infallibility. Mr. Lofton might also say that there are too many views in the Orthodox Church on what makes a council binding, and he will point to figures like Florovsky, Heers, Ware, or Komiakov, who either deny there is such a standard, or who imply that there are many. But while he can point to those, we can point to the standard set by the Seventh Ecumenical Council, when it stated that no council can be ecumenical without the approval of all the patriarchates. We can also appeal to the witness of the saints contained in the 2 Florilegiums, which we compiled on our website. More recently, we can appeal to the reasoning Russia used to not attend Crete, that not all of the patriarchates would be there, and that it therefore would not be representative of the Church. Who should we trust more, the Seventh Ecumenical Council, or a priest who won't tell anyone who his bishop is? Who would we trust most, the Seventh Ecumenical Council and the witness of the saints, or a titular bishop who does not represent his synod? Who should we trust more, the Seventh Ecumenical Council, the witness of the saints and the official statements of the Russian and Greek churches, or an 18th century mathematician? The answer is clear, and so fleeing to persons like Florovsky, Heers, Ware, and Komiakov does no more than appeal to Father James Martin or Marcel Lefebvre. For Mr. Lofton, though, he desperately needs the Orthodox Church to not have a way of defining dogma, because he has to portray it as Protestant-like chaos in order to frighten disheartened and disillusioned Catholics from looking into the Orthodox Church. This next clip comes from the video An Orthodox Priest Becomes an Evangelical Pastor, Part 2, minute 14 and 12 seconds to 16 minutes and 9 seconds.
It's the analogy I've used a million times. Somebody breaks into my house. Let's give 2 scenarios. 1, I have a gun, but I choose not to use it. That's one scenario. Scenario 2, somebody breaks into my house. I don't have a gun, and therefore I can't use one. You see the difference? In both cases, I don't use a gun. But one, it's because I chose not to. But there's a fundamental difference between the two. I had the ability. I could have. And that's the difference between us and every other communion. We have the ability to clarify things definitively. And if it's not clear enough, you could go back to the Magisterium again, repeat the process until it becomes abundantly clear. To the point that it's so clear, like Munificentissimus Deus. Because nobody would say that that's unclear, right? You might say that I don't agree with the Magisterium. It's fine. We can have that discussion. We can have the discussion, why is the Magisterium reliable? How is it actually something that was divinely instituted? We can have that discussion. But make no mistake about it. Whatever the source and origin of our Magisterium, whether it's from God or it's just from man, it's still objectively different than any other communion because you can objectively identify it and you can repeat this process of asking for clarification until you get an objective answer that is considered definitive and binding. You can't do that in Eastern Orthodoxy and Oriental Orthodoxy. That's what makes us different. And yes, papacy is included in that, right? Because without a papacy, you don't have an objective way to identify the Magisterium.
The main flaw with Mr. Lofton's metaphor is it assumes as correct his assertion that the Orthodox Church lacks an objective method of defining dogma apart from an infallible autocrat. To give an idea of how asinine and limited Mr. Lofton's argument is, by this reasoning he would have to argue that only a dictatorship can formulate laws, but that neither a republic, nor an oligarchy, nor a limited democracy would be capable of formulating a legal code. Yet we all know that these forms of government can and do formulate legal codes. Such a narrow criterion as to how a church can form dogma is a clue as to why he has never once offered a response to the answer that when a council or creed is accepted by all of the churches, it becomes dogma. His closest attempt at explaining why one supposedly needs a lone autocrat to know what dogma is is to instead move the goalposts and retort with some asinine question along the lines of, accepted by who? An anonymous bishop I won't name said something unofficial, and then some Orthodox said this and some Orthodox say that about the Immaculate Conception on Facebook. But the answer of who must accept it is clear: the bishops, because the bishops are the only ones that occupy the teaching office within the church. The laity don't, the deacons don't, the priests don't. In the ecumenical councils, only the bishops, or their representatives, were allowed to cast votes precisely because the office of teaching is entrusted to them. Therefore, a more appropriate metaphor than the one presented by Mr. Lofton is that our way of defining dogma avoids the pitfalls of placing all our eggs in one basket, as the Vatican I dogma creates a situation analogous to firing blindly and frantically at a barely visible shadow, while our method of conciliarity depends on actually identifying what the target is before firing. This is why we have never felt the need to define dogmas for the sake of defining dogmas, such as the Catholic Church did in the case of the Immaculate Conception. There was no reason to define it, as there was no large-scale movement within the Catholic Church challenging the sinlessness of the Mother of God at that time any more than at any other time. The same is true in regards to the dogma of the Assumption of the Mother of God. There had been private disputes about this for 700 years, but no public heresy, and so defining a dogma that popes had largely refused to rule on for so many centuries comes across as an overreaction equivalent to firing a Scud missile at a tangerine. Ironically, Mr. Lofton inadvertently undermines the decree on the Immaculate Conception in the show R&T Live with Michael Lofton, March the 1st, 2022, minute marks 1 hour 3 minutes and 56 seconds to 1 hour 4 minutes and 45 seconds.
Do I think that there should be a fifth dogma on the Blessed Mother? Nope. I don't think we need to dogmatize something unless it's absolutely necessary. I don't think it's just, unless it's necessary, we're just adding unnecessary barriers between us and the other communions. So if it's necessary, sure, we got to do what we got to do and settle a theological dispute. Sure. But is there anything that's really seriously in dispute right now that is really pressing on souls and salvation is really dependent on settling? I don't know of that, right? That doesn't describe any situation that we're in. So I don't think it would be prudent to dogmatize another doctrine on the Virgin Mary unless souls were at stake.
There was nothing that was seriously in dispute when the Immaculate Conception was decreed. Similarly, there was nothing seriously in dispute when the Assumption of Mary was decreed either. You will remember that Mr. Lofton repeatedly criticised us for supposedly not having a position on the Immaculate Conception, but he fails to deal with the fact that despite there being an ex cathedra decree on the Assumption of Mary, the Catholic Church is unclear on whether or not she died while we are. In fact, we have an entire feast based around the death of the Mother of God, called the Dormition of the Theotokos. Yet Michael gives the Catholic Church a free pass on that. So, when we lack a decree on a specific issue the Catholic Church has decreed on, it's obviously because of a fault in our ecclesiology. But when the Catholic Church lacks a decree on a specific issue the Orthodox Church is clear on, well, it just isn't that important, and we can all have our own opinions about it. This double standard is Mr. Lofton's modus operandi. In the show, an Orthodox priest becomes an evangelical pastor, Part 2, minute mark 16 and 8 seconds to 17 minutes and 9 seconds, Mr. Lofton even makes the obvious strawman argument that having an emperor somehow moves us closer to dogmatic surety.
You might have that with an emperor. All right. If you had an emperor still, you might be able to identify what an ecumenical council is at that point. Although the difficulty then is going to be, but sometimes emperors called an ecumenical council and they called it an ecumenical council, but then it actually wasn't an ecumenical council. You might offer some pushback and say, but there have been times where that has similarly taken place with the papacy, right? But we can still ask for a definitive clarification. Whereas I don't think you can do that with the emperor. because where's the emperor today? Or a council called by an emperor. I mean, the emperor himself's probably not going to be doing the clarification. Although, I don't know, Justinian might. But putting that issue to the side, you see the fundamental difference, though.
No one is claiming that the acceptance of a council by the emperor makes it dogmatic. Absolutely no one. So Mr. Lofton is creating a straw man argument here. Further, it is a straw man that reveals Mr. Lofton's own lack of familiarity with church history, as anyone familiar with our ecclesiology would see this as a non-argument, because events like the Arian crisis, the fallout over Chalcedon, the controversy surrounding monoenergism and monothelitism, and the waves of iconoclasm all demonstrate that the Church was at odds with the Emperor at a rate only slightly less than it was in accord with the Emperor, and those controversies, as well as the imperial attempts to enforce heresy via councils, are major content in primers of Church history. Now, we do not think Mr. Lofton is being deceptive here, and we are not saying that to be charitable, but rather we say it because we consider him so historically illiterate that such a counter-argument could not even occur to him. In this following clip from Reason and Theology's show Review, An Orthodox Priest Becomes an Evangelical Pastor, minute marks 34 and 56 seconds through 35 minutes and 29 seconds, Mr. Lofton claims Orthodox churches differ with one another on matters of faith, but he never states what those matters are.
I think Catholics and Orthodox are going to both agree unity means unity in faith, government, and worship. But you push back a little bit with Orthodox on that one, and I don't think you're going to find a definitive answer. What do you mean by unity in faith? Are you really united in matters of faith? I would actually say no. I would say that there are theological issues that touch on matters of faith that Orthodox can't agree on. So,
notice that Mr. Lofton fails to provide even a single reference to even one official statement of a synod related to these supposed differences, much less providing examples of these supposed differences. As usual, he relies on vague assertions. What exactly are matters of faith and morals that we cannot agree on? Can he cite official statements from Orthodox churches showing that we are at odds on matters of faith that we consider dogmatic? Probably not. He could probably provide some statements by random Orthodox academics and clergy, but he would need official statements from synods of bishops that comprise a church to prove his point. He might bring up primacy, but that is not a matter of faith for us, rather of organisation. And when we read the official statements, specifically the one at Chieti, there is no disagreement about what that primacy consists of. Even when we read the various views of Ravenna, once it is noticed that Russia repeatedly defines primacy at the universal level to be the Catholic understanding of primacy, we can see Russia's views align with everyone else's. They then proved this by signing the Chieti document. The following two clips are from the show An Orthodox Priest Becomes an Evangelical Pastor Part 2 and are from minute mark 11 and 31 seconds to 14 minutes and 12 seconds.
But the fundamental difference between us and everybody else who has apostolic succession is we have an objective magisterium and an objective way to identify it, and it has an objective way to sort through and put to rest theological controversies in the church. It has that ability, and that ability can be exercised definitively. That can be done in the Catholic Church. It cannot be done in Eastern Orthodoxy or Oriental Orthodoxy. For anybody who wants to say, well, an ecumenical council does that. Okay, but what constitutes an ecumenical council?
Here is exactly the situation we repeatedly mention. Mr. Lofton does not provide arguments as to why the consensus of all the synods cannot definitively define dogma. Rather, he simply ignores the answer and moves the goalposts, pretending that an ecumenical council cannot be defined, despite the fact that the Seventh Ecumenical Council defined in its official documents, specifically the Horus dismantling the Synod of Hieria, what an ecumenical council is. Further, the answer to what an ecumenical synod is covered fully in our video from March 2021 entitled Vatican Catholic Refuted on Orthodoxy and Ecumenical Councils, When LARPing Goes Wrong. But the short answer is that an ecumenical council is one that is accepted by all the synods who are already in communion prior to the council. That is what makes it binding upon the Church Universal, that all of the synods have ratified it as properly reflecting the Orthodox faith. It is exceptionally simple to understand, but Mr. Lofton desperately needs to create the illusion that the situation is a Gordian knot solvable only by adopting Vatican I. Mr. Lofton immediately continues.
And you might say, well, what constitutes something ex cathedra, right? Right. Heard that one a million times. Well, let's just, first of all, Munificentissimus Deus. Is that in this dispute? Wouldn't you recognize that as ex cathedra? Clearly, right? But you might say, okay, well, Ordinatio Sacerdotalis is that ex cathedra, right? There might be some cases that are a little less clear than Munificentissimus Deus. Fair enough. Does that mean that it's just still entirely gray and there's no way to identify what's ex cathedra objectively? Doesn't follow. Because of what Justin Martyr said, living magisterium. We can go back to the magisterium and say, hey, is Ordinatio Sacerdotalis ex cathedra? And then it gives an answer, right? And if that answer is not clear, we can go back to the magisterium and ask it again. And they could answer, and we can repeat the process until it becomes so abundantly clear that we know for certain Ordinatio Sacerdotalis is considered definitive in the Catholic Church. We can repeat that process. Now you might say, oh, well, but sometimes the magisterium doesn't answer questions. Right. There's a difference between being able to do something and actually doing it. For sure. Yeah. I recognize that sometimes the magisterium doesn't clarify something. At least not in a good, reasonable amount of time. Sure. But the question is, can it? Right? Because there's a fundamental difference between a body that has the ability to clarify itself and a body that doesn't have the ability at all.
Mr. Lofton provides no argument or reasoning as to why Orthodox Christians cannot repeatedly go back to the synods and ask them to clarify something. It does not even necessarily have to be a council, but simply a statement of faith. After all, statements of faith are what councils produce, so the end result is the same. This following clip is from the show Why an Eastern Orthodox Became Catholic, and the timestamps are 29 minutes and 33 seconds to 30 minutes and 54 seconds.
Yeah. So the question, one question that is debated among Orthodox is artificial contraception, of course, right? Now, Catholics have a objective answer to this in Humanae Vitae. And any Catholic who dissents from it is just that, in dissent. Whereas the Eastern Orthodox don't have a definitive statement on the use of artificial contraception. So then how do you say that somebody is in dissent, right? How do you say somebody is wrong? You could say, well, in my opinion, they're not in accord with Scripture and tradition, or in the opinion of my patriarch, they're not in accord with Scripture and tradition. But that will only get you so far. What happens when the next guy says, but my patriarch says it's okay and under these conditions? And my conscience tells me it's okay under these conditions. Well, what do we do then, right? The answer that my bishop allows it, or my patriarch allows it, or my synod has said this, that's not going to give us a definitive answer when another synod says something else. So that's one issue. And I would say it's a pretty big one, in fact.
First, as most of our viewers know, we did a video on the history of contraception and patristic thought, and we ask that you please watch that video before asking questions or posting objections to it. Simply, having a statement on something seems to be what Mr. Lofton desires, rather than having a correct decision. In other words, statements for the sake of statements is preferable to patristic and accurate decisions because, as those who watched our video on contraception know, up until relatively recently, the churches had not cared to rule synodically on the topic of contraception and, considering the sheer amount and repetition of canons in regards to other sexual sins, such as masturbation, sodomy, abortion, homosexuality, bestiality, etc., one would assume that we would see a similar amount of canons and repetitions in regard to contraception, but we see none. What we do see, though, is a small number of church fathers commenting directly on the topic, and they repeatedly condemn it in the context of sex during non-fertile periods, whether that is the vast majority of the month, during pregnancy, during breastfeeding, during menstruation, after menopause, etc. In other words, the patristic witness that does exist on it is strongly against the allowances made by both Humanae Vitae and Castica Nubiae. Taking this into consideration, generally speaking, contraception is not the idol to us that it is to the Roman Catholics, and so we see it within the wisdom of a confessor to allow or prohibit contraception, whether natural or artificial. Having a statement is not necessarily a good thing, because you can have really bad statement, and that's what Humanae Vitae is. It was a compromise and allowed something that is arguably more effective than artificial birth control. Every natural family planning website that we have visited has advertised how incredibly effective it is at preventing pregnancy, and viewing the exceptionally low failure rates NFP practitioners tout for themselves, failure rates for it versus, say, condoms, you start to realise that NFP is not only far more effective at stopping conception than artificial birth control, but it also runs counter to the small patristic witness there is on the topic of contraception, as it aims to limit births and encourages sex outside of fertile periods. But for people who struggle with scrupulosity, the arguments alleging a lack of clarity really hit home and rattle them, because they want something that reassures them and substitutes for the confidence that they sorely lack, yet desperately need, in order to live a happy and productive life, and so simply having something, whether correct or not, fills a gigantic gap for them. But if what you want is epistemological certainty, become a Mormon. Mormonism has a fantastic system of epistemological certainty, but when you point that out, these people will immediately point out that Mormonism isn't true, and will then, ironically, use their own judgment to justify why Mormonism isn't correct. You have to use your own judgment at a certain point. And so we should say that what Mr. Lofton is in search of is not so much correct answers, but rather definitive ones. Whether those answers are right or not, whether they are on issues that are actually needing definitive answers or not, is effectively irrelevant to Mr. Lofton and others who struggle with scrupulosity, so long as they have a definitive answer on any given topic, and it is this attitude that gets you the Immaculate Conception, a definitive statement by a half-crazed and impetuous pope on a topic that was not under any real debate and has little, if any, patristic support, while being outright rejected by major scholastics. But Mr. Lofton fails to note that there are a number of areas in which the Orthodox Church possesses a definitive statement on issues that the Catholic Church does not. One major example is the topic of essence and energies. Our Palamite councils and the anathemas from them are liturgically commemorated on the second Sunday of Lent, in which St. Gregory Palamas is specifically commemorated for his theology in a second triumph of orthodoxy. Furthermore, they have been adopted into various synodica. But in the Catholic Church there is no clarity on whether Thomism, Scotism, or even the essence-energies distinction is correct. Now, even if Scotism is correct, there is no consensus even among Scotists on what the formal distinction even is. Another example is that despite theologians of the past discussing options regarding how to handle a heretical pope, the Catholic Church lacks a teaching on what to do with a heretical pope. It even lacks a teaching on whether or not the Pope can be deposed, and if so, for which reasons, and by whom. There are numerous opinions of theologians, but none of them have been canonized or recognized as such. In fact, Michael Lofton did an entire show in which he admits that there is no teaching or canonical precedent to depose a pope in the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church also lacks a definitive teaching on which councils are ecumenical, which papal statements are ex cathedra, and which popes were real popes as opposed to anti-popes. It should be noted that the official list of popes kept by the Vatican is regularly updated and edited not by any definitive magisterial statement, but by scholars. This is important because one would need to know who the real pope is in order to know which councils are truly ecumenical and which decrees are truly ex cathedra. But to all of these, Catholic apologists would argue that these are areas in which ambiguity is allowable, and, using that double standard, would hypocritically give themselves a free pass while criticising us for lacking definitive teachings in some areas that they consider important. And so, just as the situation with the Immaculate Conception and contraception, Mr. Lofton assumes that simply because the Catholic Church thinks it is a big deal, therefore it is to everyone else, and that therefore a lack of ruling on it is a systematic failure. Again, Mr. Lofton has to take into account that we do not exist in reaction to the Catholic Church, but rather as our own entity, and making statements on topics for the sake of statements is a horrible use of our bishop's time and energy. In the next clip, from Mr. Lofton's slow, seething 4-hour-long rant on a live stream entitled Response to AFR, Mr. Lofton doubles down on the claim that we have no objective teaching authority. The timestamps are 2 hours, 55 minutes and 11 seconds to 2 hours, 56 minutes and 59 seconds. To keep the flow of Mr. Lofton's thought, we have omitted a small segment in the middle of this clip in which Mr. Lofton interrupts himself in order to address a viewer in the chat who goes by the name Smoke Pork Ribs and who asks an unrelated question.
They don't have a single unified theory to determine what is an ecumenical council. Now, I'm not saying the Catholic theory is just so easy that it's just bam. No, I mean, there doesn't need to be a little bit of work that needs to be done and some qualifications. Absolutely, sure. And I'm not saying that we've always had a consistent theory that's always been explicitly clear. But after 2,000 years, you should know. And when you don't have any other teaching authority, you should definitely know now what an ecumenical council is. I mean, at least we could say, okay, well, if we're uncertain about an ecumenical council, we still at least have our, teachings that are ex cathedra, and we at least still have the ordinary and universal magisterium. Like we at least have something. Y'all don't have really anything above an ecumenical council, so you should at least know what an ecumenical council is. Yeah, I'm not saying that, we've always had just a perfect theory known from day one. No. Nobody has ever had this, right? But by now, you should have a theory, especially when all you have above the Synod is an ecumenical council. You should know what constitutes an ecumenical council. You want to talk to us about ecumenical councils, but you can't really tell me what identifies an ecumenical council. You want to tell me to affirm the 7 councils, but why 7? You can't really give me a consistent answer there. And I'm going to say that might be a sign of something for you. Maybe.
Again, and we cannot say this enough, if all of these local synods who are in communion with one another agree on a council or creedal statement, how is that not a definitive magisterium? In the 400 or so shows we have watched from Reason and Theology, only once does Mr. Lofton come even close in attempting to address this question, and that is in the video entitled Thoughts for a New Convert to Eastern Orthodoxy, from minute marks 37 and 46 seconds to 40 minutes and 38 seconds. But after mentioning this objection, he then skirts the question with a red herring.
Can the Orthodox objectively figure out what they are obligated to believe through their ordinary and universal magisterium? Okay, so this is a good question. First of all, they're not going to call it that. But is there an analogous concept in Eastern Orthodoxy? Somewhat.
Not exactly. Because obviously we're going to say the ordinary and universal magisterium is the College of Bishops, and the College of Bishops includes the Pope. It can never not include the Pope. Otherwise, it's not the College of Bishops. So clearly, we're going to define the ordinary and universal magisterium conceptually differently than they do. But I guess you're asking, like, do they have the equivalent of an ordinary and universal magisterium minus the Pope? So, like, their version of the College of Bishops, perhaps, collectively all of the synods of bishops, and the bishops throughout the ages. There is somewhat of a concept like that. Again, they're not going to call it ordinary and universal magisterium. They tend to shy away from the term magisterium itself. But is there an analogous concept there? Somewhat. They're going to appeal to the constant tradition, or appeal to the teaching of the bishops throughout the ages. So in that sense, there's an analogy of ordinary and universal magisterium, but the problem is, it begs the question, how do I identify that thing objectively? I can identify it objectively in Catholicism because I defined it as the College of Bishops in union with the successor of Peter, the Bishop of Rome. That gives more objectivity to it. But when you just say the constant teaching of the bishops, which bishops? I mean, the Oriental Orthodox. I mean, are we including them? The Syrian Church of the East? Do we include them in this category of constant teaching of bishops? Clearly not. They're going to say no. But isn't that arbitrary? Isn't that already assuming what we're trying to establish here? If we're trying to establish what is orthodoxy, we've already assumed what orthodoxy is by excluding the Oriental Orthodox and the Syrian Church of the East. So I need something, an objective way to identify this concept of the constant teaching of the bishops, or something like that, or the teachings of the councils. Which councils? Ephesus 2? They're going to say no. Okay, why? On what basis do I discard Ephesus 2? Well, it's not consistent with the tradition. Okay, but I thought I was trying to determine what the tradition is. I thought I'm supposed to look at ecumenical councils as witness to the tradition. Well, it's one of the witnesses of tradition, but you also have, the teaching of the local bishop, right? But some of the teachings of the local bishops could be heretical. Well, you also have the synods of bishops, right? But some of the synods of bishops could be in heresy, and some of them say conflicting things. And so,
notice how, after he read the question, he begins to touch on it, and then, realizing where it is going, decides to skirt the issue by moving the goalposts. An obvious solution to Mr. Lofton's objection would be to say that so long as those synods which were in communion before the issue was determined are in agreement over the issue, then it is dogma. And that is exactly how we have determined it, and why Mr. Lofton's attempt to bring the monophysites into the mix is a failure since, as we discussed earlier, they were not legitimate synods, but renegade members of legitimate synods who then decided to break from those legitimate synods and establish rival ones. There is no need for one man, namely Jacob Baradaeus, to ordain thousands of clergy, many of whom were bishops, throughout Syria and Egypt, if even a large minority of the legitimate synods went with the monophysites. In fact, when one reads the ecclesiastical history of the monophysite bishop John of Ephesus, they will realize just how minuscule the monophysite movement was at an episcopal level, even during the time of Emperor Saint Justinian in the 6th century. In the immediate aftermath of Chalcedon, it was a minority of bishops who rejected Chalcedon, as the monophysite movement was largely a lay movement with its strongholds in rural monasteries. As for on what basis do we discard Ephesus 2, we do so based on the fact that it was held uncanonically and therefore lacked the assent of Rome, Constantinople and Antioch. Furthermore, the depositions issued there were largely uncanonical, as the accused were not provided an opportunity to defend themselves at trial, nor were they given the opportunity to appeal the decisions to Rome per the canons of Sardica. Dioscorus then replaced the patriarchs of Constantinople and Antioch with his partisans, but with the depositions of St. Flavian of Constantinople and Domnus of Antioch, both uncanonical, as neither was given an opportunity to defend themselves, no canonical replacement could be provided. Likewise, the replacement of Domnus of Antioch, that being Maximus, was only later considered canonically regular, simply because Domnus had no desire to resume his see and gladly gave it up in order to return to his monastic life. At this point, in order to be considered canonical, the bishops of Constantinople and Antioch had to renounce their uncanonical actions, and this occurred when they mended the fence with Rome and the partisans of Saint Flavian of Constantinople in the year prior to Chalcedon. Furthermore, at the Council of Chalcedon itself, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Juvenal, who had been present at Ephesus II, was suspended for his uncanonical actions there and made to repent along with several other bishops. All those bishops present at Chalcedon, who had been present at Ephesus II, then renounced the council save for Dioscorus, who remained obstinate to the end, to the point of refusing to attend his trial by fellow bishops in the third session of Chalcedon. As for the Assyrian Church of the East, it was under the Patriarchate of Antioch at the time of Ephesus, and thereby was part of Antioch's synod. Some might point to the Persian Church's claim to functional independence from the Patriarch of Antioch in 424 at the Council of Markapta under Dadisho, but neither its mother church, Antioch, nor anyone else ever ratified that decision, thereby making it null and void. Further, it was not until later in the 5th century, at councils such as Beit Lapat, Beit Adrai, and Seleucia in 484, 485 and 486, that the Persian Church actually adopted the views of Theodore of Mopsuestia, thereby setting themselves in juxtaposition to the Council of Ephesus. So, as can be seen, not only do Mr. Lofton's red herring objections fall apart, but he fails to address the obvious fact that when all of the synods accept a council or statement as being in accord with Orthodox Christianity, by default it means it is a definitive teaching of our Church. The following 4 clips are taken from the same show as the last clip, and they are simply a continuation of the previous clip, commencing at 40 minutes and 46 seconds, and the last one ending at 47 minutes and 23 seconds.
Yeah, but, there's been a whole lot of Orthodox who tried to use that, or especially Orthodox monks who tried to use that argument to speak against the bishops. And against their teachings. What do we do there? And obviously, I could think that I have the divine energies flowing through me, enlightening my nous, and I could be wrong. And how does that differ from a Protestant who says the Holy Spirit has enlightened me and personally told to me which books are canonical and which aren't? And your Deuterocanon isn't canonical. It was interesting that we heard earlier, a blanket assertion of the canon. I don't know if Jasmine is aware of it, but there is a dispute on the canon of Scripture in Eastern Orthodoxy. There is no one canon. There is a dispute on the Deuterocanonicals and their level of authority. So you'll see some who are very hesitant to say that the Deuterocanonicals are inspired by God. So they might speak of them as canonical, and in some cases they'll say they're not canonical, but you have to ask, okay, well, what do you mean by canonical? But you'll notice it's conspicuous that some Orthodox will not use the term inspiration for them. And so we're asking the question, are they canonical in the sense of inspired Scripture? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes it's no. Is there any objectively identifiable settlement of the...
What Mr. Lofton leaves out here is that the Catholic Church also has a debate on what is and is not inspired. Trent only listed the minimum books. It did not put a cap on them, meaning that additional books can be inspired, and, for whatever it's worth, the various Uniate bodies usually have additional books in their official Bibles. In our situation, a fairly small number of books, really Revelation, the Prayer of Manasseh, 4th Maccabees and 3rd Esdras, are in what Mr. Lofton would consider a position of dispute, but considering that the Confession of Dositheus lays down the canon, and considering that the confession has been accepted by all of the synods of the Church, it is unclear how, if at all, the situation of a narrow canon and a broader canon differs from the position of the Roman Catholic Church at Trent and the broader canons of many Uniate bodies.
No, because in Orthodoxy, there hasn't been a definitive judgment on the canon. You could maybe appeal to Jerusalem 1672, but all an Orthodox has to do, and some of them do at this point, is just say, well, that was overly Latin in expression council, and we haven't received every bit of it, as Callistus Ware noted, and his works. Not all of it has been received. Okay, well, what part has and hasn't been received? And so you'll see clearly there's not a universal reception and acceptance of 1672, at least not presently. There was, at least at the time of 1672, but not necessarily today. So even that appeal kind of falls short, and there are Orthodox who give pushback there. So it's not this, knockout argument that says, see, Orthodoxy has a established canon. Not exactly. Somebody's saying Jerusalem 1672 is something you have to accept as Orthodox, not according to Callistus Ware and a few others. They're going to say not all of 1672 has been received. Go and read Callistus Ware again. And again, he's not the only one who's saying it. They're going to say some parts of 1672 have to be received and some parts haven't been received. And so when you say it has to be accepted, that's not exactly true. Parts of it maybe need to be. But then when you start asking unorthodox questions like, well, what part needs to be accepted of 1672 and what part doesn't, then you start to get into really subjective answers where there isn't really an objective answer to that. You're going to get different answers. And I'm going to say, well, okay, all right, well, I can ask Catholics questions and I'll get different answers. But the difference between us at this point is I can still point you to an objectively identifiable answer through the Magisterium. But I can't do that with Orthodoxy. Okay.
Notice the vague citation. Go read Callistus Ware. Is Mr. Lofton aware that Ware wrote dozens of books and hundreds of articles? But that aside, the late titular bishop Callistus Ware was not a synod of bishops, nor was he speaking as an official representative of the synod of which he was a part. So he was speaking with his own opinion here.
So let's do a share screen. Somebody saying, sounds like Orthodox is a bit all over the place. But, in the fairness to the Orthodox, wasn't the early church? In fairness to the Orthodox, was it the early church? You find the early church all over the place, right? Did you have a settled canon in the early church? Not exactly. So in that sense, they're not a whole lot different than the early church here. My problem is with that is it's excusable that the early church was kind of all over the place because they're the early church. After 2,000 years, we should be more grown up than the early church. We should have settled through some of these issues. We shouldn't be disputing still whether or not to receive converts through rebaptism. I thought that was already settled in the middle of the 3rd century. What are we doing? Still having this discussion in Orthodoxy. It just shouldn't. But anyways, we shouldn't say, well, because the early church in its infantile, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, in its infant state, was all over the place, that means somehow that we today should be. No, after a certain point in time, you should grow up, you should mature in the faith, and we've had a whole lot of more additional time to think and deal with these issues than the early church did. So there should be some progress by 2,000 years later. So again, in fairness to the Orthodox, the early church was a lot like that.
Here is that ugly double standard again. If we do not have a statement on something that the Vatican does, we are obviously deficient. But if the Vatican lacks a statement on something, it's just simply unnecessary or imprudent to make one. As discussed elsewhere in this video, Mr. Lofton assumes that everyone else just exists in reaction to the Vatican's actions, and that the moment the Vatican rules on something, our synods suddenly need to spring into action to either agree or disagree. On another note, the topic of rebaptism was not settled in the 3rd century, as Pope St. Stephen's position was not taken up by the Catholic Church, since Pope Stephen was accepting even Gnostic and Marcionite baptisms, a position that the Catholic Church outright rejects, for the same reason it rejects Mormons and Jehovah's Witness baptisms. They are not Trinitarian. But the fact that the rebaptism controversy of the 3rd century had not at all been settled is why, at various points after the 3rd century, notably at Nicaea and Trullo, there were canons on how to receive converts from schismatic and heretical sects. The current practice for the handful of churches to baptize all converts regardless of their background is not a dispute on beliefs, but a decision of prudence, as Rocor's current position might be described as a corrective baptism to supplement any lack in the non-orthodox baptism they received. We know this because a person who is received by chrismation when Rocor would have baptized them is not refused communion upon transferring to Rocor. The same is true of those on Mount Athos. They are not refused communion when they come, but when a person is received on Mount Athos, they will be baptized almost regardless of their background. Now, what is most dangerous is that Mr. Lofton's reasoning as to why we are not allowed to be as, quote, all over the place as the early church is the same reasoning the Episcopal Church uses to justify the ordination of women, so-called marriage of homosexuals, and all sorts of insane abuses and heresy. That enough time has passed, and we are mature enough now to see past it and come to new developments in the name of, as he states, quote, progress.
But also in response to that, but we shouldn't stay in that state. Now, we didn't have a solemn definition on the canon until arguably Florence or Trent, right? Certainly Trent, but maybe even arguably Florence. So we go quite a long time without a solemn definition, but in fairness to the Catholics, we didn't really need a solemn definition since those local councils of Hippo, Carthage, and Rome were kind of enough to settle the issue. So we didn't really need that kind of universal judgment since the local conciliar judgments was sufficient. But by the time that you have Cajetan and others, and especially Luther, starting to dispute the canonicity of certain books, then it became necessary to offer a solemn definition. But Orthodox also have Protestants claiming their canon is not fully correct, and so have the Orthodox been able to respond to that? Well, they tried to in 1672, but as I've already shown,
there was heavy dispute over the canon in the first millennium, even after Rome supposedly ruled on it. For example, Trullo, a council accepted in both the East and, believe it or not, the West, provided a list that differs significantly from those of the synods Mr. Lofton mentions. Likewise, the numerous canons of the various Monophysite bodies who rejected Chalcedon and the Assyrian Church, which eventually came to reject Cyrillian theology, differed from the canon defined at Hippo in 393 and Carthage in 397. Now Mr. Lofton mentions a Council of Rome and is most likely referring to the one held in 382, as that is typically cited by Catholic apologists. There are just two problems. No one contemporary with the council seems to have heard of it. Case in point, St. Jerome, who was translating the Vulgate and therefore would have been most impacted by it, shows no awareness of the council when he denounces the deuterocanonical books. Considering he was being commissioned by the Pope to translate the Bible, one would imagine St. Jerome would be most privy to papal decrees concerning the books he was to translate, yet he decries the deuterocanonical books in his introduction to the 4 books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, writing, quote, "This preface to the Scriptures may serve as a helmeted introduction to all the books which we turn from Hebrew into Latin, so that we may be assured that what is not found in our list must be placed amongst the apocryphal writings. Wisdom, therefore, which generally bears the name of Solomon, and the book of Jesus, the son of Sirach, and Judith and Tobias, and the shepherd, are not in the canon. The first book of Maccabees I have found to be Hebrew, the second is Greek, as can be proved from the very style." The preface from which this quotation is taken is believed to have been written in 391, just 9 years after a Council of Rome supposedly decreed that these books were inspired and part of the canon, so it seems odd that St. Jerome, the man tasked with translating the Bible, and to whom the decrees of the supposed Council of 382 would immediately affect, would be seemingly unaware of them. Furthermore, no other contemporary seems to have heard of this list, supposedly compiled in 382. Case in point, a Synod of Hippo held in 393 lists the canon now accepted by the Roman Catholic Church, and a Synod of Carthage held in 397 confirms said canon, but then states that its decrees are dependent upon the ratification of Rome. Had Rome decreed, and had it followed the type of Vatican I style model Catholic apologists insist existed from the beginning, there would be no reason for Hippo or Carthage to rule on it, but merely to humbly accept the decision with obedience. But let us pretend that Rome had made a judgment that was non-definitive, as Mr. Lofton is claiming. All others would still be obliged to hold to that too, under pain of mortal sin. But let us pretend that is not the case at all. Let us pretend this is just a local list of the Church at Rome. Even then, why would a council in Carthage ask for the Roman Synod's approval on a canon that was identical to one already codified by Rome? The answer is that the council had never heard of the list supposedly produced by Rome in 382. Now there are a number of logical fallacies, the most commonly known being the straw man and the ad hominem. The straw man being a misrepresentation of an opponent's argument in order to create the illusion of a ruthless takedown of a weak argument. We are purposefully replaying clips of Mr. Lofton speaking and providing you, the viewers, with the timestamps so that you can see for yourselves that we are keeping these in their proper context. An ad hominem would be if we attack the person instead of the argument, or that we disqualify an argument based on the motives instead of engaging the argument. Similar to the ad hominem is the genetic fallacy, also known as the source fallacy. In that fallacy, an argument is discounted because of who or where it comes from, while the cogency or internal consistency of the argument is never engaged. So, for example, let us pretend there is a divorced Catholic apologist who had been living with his girlfriend and their love child for close to a year while hosting an apologetics show and prior to gaining an annulment from his first wife. We could say that such a person is dishonest, deceptive, and just downright sleazy, but we cannot say their arguments are incorrect, based simply on their immoral and undeniably hypocritical behaviour. In other words, they are a hypocrite, but their arguments might still be cogent. Likewise, let us pretend another apologist was morbidly obese, or had a drinking problem, or indulged in illegal substances, or was involved in homosexual activity, or whatever else. We could speak to the fact that this person's lack of control makes them a poor image of a Christian, as control over the stomach's desires is the first step in mastery over the passions. But does their addiction to food, alcohol, or drugs mean their arguments are automatically lacking cogency? No, we wouldn't know until we actually encountered these arguments, and they could very likely deserve a response. Likewise, if a detractor were to claim that our anonymity means they do not need to respond, it comes off as grasping at straws, or just sheer desperation, because to claim our identity has anything to do with the cogency of the arguments falls into the genetic fallacy. In similar vein, claiming that someone is uncharitable, or claiming that they have a short fuse or that they cause drama, these may make the person look bad, but to claim that their arguments are somehow defective because of it is nothing less than the source fallacy and is a form of the ad hominem. Now, with that out of the way, and being that we have been and we are continuing to respond to Mr. Lofton's arguments themselves, and not using his motives as an excuse to avoid answering them, we would like to point out that Mr. Lofton's arguments are those of a scrupulous person for an audience that struggles with scrupulosity. In other words, he is desperate to keep Catholics from leaving for the Orthodox Church, and that is certainly his right as a Catholic. He should attempt to keep people in the Church which he believes in, but he is doing so by playing on the fears of those who struggle with anxiety and scrupulosity. In other words, he is offering them a Catholicism in which there is perfect doctrinal clarity and the rules are all perfectly laid out, juxtaposed to a supposed chaotic and blurry Orthodox Christianity. In short, his message is along the lines of, stay here where you know what the rules are, because if you go over there, you won't know what is going on, your anxiety will go through the roof, and you'll be a perpetual nervous wreck. Now, such emotional pleading and fear-mongering is more so a sign of desperation and grasping at straws rather than actual content in argument, and as we have seen, Mr. Lofton really only makes assertions with minimal content to back it up. But, in those rare instances in which Mr. Lofton does provide statements to back up his assertions against the Orthodox Church, it is the same 4 or 5 statements that he repeats ad nauseum, and, as we will see in this video as well as the following video, he usually fails to correctly understand them. This following clip comes from the show Collegiality and Primacy in Orthodox Ecclesiology, with Michael Lofton, minute mark 12 and 16 seconds to 13 minutes and 8 seconds.
But, hey, at some point in time, we need some answers here. At some point in time, we need some solutions when it comes to the matter of authority, because unless you have that, you can't really solve any other issues, doctrinal, liturgical, juridical, whatever issue they may be. You can't solve those in the Orthodox world until you really have a consistent and objective way to identify authoritative teachings and so on. And you can't just say, well, put it all in the synod. That's not good enough. And we're seeing why. The current schism should tell you why that's not good enough. And you can't just say, well, just put it all in the hands of the local bishop. That's not good enough. And you should know by now why that's not good enough. So,
except the solution to the Western Schism was a council that annulled the election of the very figure Mr. Lofton is claiming will solve a schism. And so we see again that Mr. Lofton gives the Catholic Church a free pass when the papacy fails and the solution lies in a synod providing a ruling, but when we place our solution in a synod, it's suddenly a systematic failure. This double standard, this hypocrisy, this obliviousness to history is what Mr. Lofton's entire apologetic against us marinates in. But what is truly ironic is that after lambasting us with the false accusation that we lack an objective means of defining dogma, Mr. Lofton then admits the Magisterium is unclear and needs someone to develop what is essentially an interpretive key or decoder ring researched and organised by none other than Mr. Michael Lofton. No, not by the Pope, not by the College of Cardinals, not by the Episcopate, none of these, but by Mr. Lofton, who will come to the rescue of Catholic dogma and doctrine, saving it from the jaws of ambiguity. This occurs in the show R&T Morning Show with Michael Lofton, June the 17th, 2021, from minute marks 11 and 3 seconds through 11 minutes and 52 seconds.
So, there have been some changes in some of the indicators throughout time. They're fairly established at this point. I think that we have enough to identify objectively what is definitive, what is not, fairly easily. So I think it would be a little bit harder previously, but I think now it's fairly easy to establish. It's just a matter of somebody taking the different principles here and there and putting them together and drawing out some implications from them. And that's kind of what I'm doing, is systematizing things and then drawing out the implications. And
wow, I thought that is what the Pope was for. The supposed clarity of Catholic teachings now rests not on the established magisterium of the Catholic Church, but on a guy in rural Louisiana who is earning a non-accredited PhD and hosts podcasts from his garage. Now, there is nothing wrong with what Michael is doing, nor with what he is earning, nor from where he is hosting his podcast. But when we are repeatedly being told that the Catholic Church has the doctrinal and dogmatic clarity other sects lack, yet the Pope and bishops egregiously fail to clarify that, and it falls to a layman with no teaching mandate, the claims ring hollow, as we are suddenly confronted with the fact that Mr. Lofton is forced into doing no more than the average Protestant who combs through the Bible and Strong's Concordance, attempting to organise a summary of Christian doctrines. In the same show, Mr. Lofton continues with this at minute marks 11 and 54 seconds through 14 minutes and 21 seconds.
So, for example, again, we know Munificentissimus Deus is ex cathedra. Okay, well, what are the indicators that you see in Munificentissimus Deus? And that way you could start to look for those objective ways to identify things. They might not be limited to them, right? There could be other indicators as well. Just because the indicators, used in Munificentissimus Deus, for example, means that the document is, the proposition that he defined is definitive. Just because there's indicators there doesn't mean that those have to be the same indicators used perhaps by Pope Leo X in Exsurge Domine. They could be slightly different, right? So that's part of the challenge, is talking about all the different indicators throughout different periods of time in history, and then discussing the indicators that might be present for the papal magisterium, some of the indicators that might be present for the conciliar magisterium. And then and in that case, you have to look for solemn indicators. And then you have to also look for, how do you then identify that something has been definitively taught by the ordinary and universal magisterium? Because that's not really documented. That's not done solemnly. So it's going to be a little more challenging to identify those. So we would say, for example, that women's ordination for the priesthood is closed because the ordinary and universal magisterium has excluded it. Okay, well, what are the indicators that would show that that has been excluded, right? We have to discuss some of those things. And I've discussed some of the principles behind all of this here and there in different videos, but I've never just taken it all together and really explained everything in one video. I do intend to do that. Not that you can really say everything in one video, but kind of take a summary view. I do intend to do that, hopefully soon. And then just continue to expand on that with more and more details as I continue to progress with the dissertation. So plenty more to come there.
So again, Mr. Lofton is telling you that the Vatican has not clarified dogma, but that you have to rely either on yourself to sort through all of these code words to discover the answers yourself, or, better yet, you can just listen to Mr. Lofton attempt to substitute himself into the place of what the Catholic magisterium should, according to him, be doing for you. Again, there is no definitively taught list of ex cathedra statements, no definitely taught list of popes, nor is there a definitely taught list of ecumenical councils. In other words, the magisterium has simply left it up to you to figure out which decrees are ex cathedra, which councils are ecumenical, and which popes were true popes and which were anti-popes. That last one is set forth in a work called the Annuario Pontificio and is regularly updated. Case in point, in 1942, the Annuario Pontificio accepted the decision of the 1409 Council of Pisa by listing Alexander V immediately after Gregory XII. Alexander V's successor was John XXIII, but 20 years later, in 1962, the Annuario Pontificio reversed that decision and considered Alexander V and the Pisan Pope John XXIII as anti-popes, and handed the title of the 23rd over to Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli, who had at this point been pope since his election in 1958. This made Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli the new John XXIII. But it seems odd that the Catholic Church would have no definitive teaching on something so central to their ecclesiology. Without a definite teaching on who the real popes have been, there can be no surety on which councils are ecumenical, nor on which decrees are ex cathedra. This damages Mr. Lofton's case because it puts him into the same category that he falsely accuses us of being in, dogmatic ambiguity. But let us pretend we really are in the same boat as the Catholic Church in this matter. That still does not help Mr. Lofton's case, because we are not the ones claiming to have a magisterium set up by God and offering the best dogmatic clarity available, but Mr. Lofton is the person trying to claim that. But here we see Mr. Lofton continues at it with this gem from the show Open Mic with Mike, R&T Live, February the 25th, 2022, minute marks 1 hour 42 minutes and 26 seconds through 1 hour 43 minutes and 50 seconds, in which he states that popes can speak ex cathedra without realizing it. Further, regardless of how many times the Vatican has clarified that Ordinatio Sacerdotalis is not at all ex cathedra, but is rather ordinary and universal magisterium, Mr. Lofton asserts that it probably actually is ex cathedra. In fact, Mr. Lofton even inadvertently admits that it breaks his decoder ring theory.
Ordinatio Sacerdotalis seems to have all of the indicators for something that's ex cathedra, which is why I lean to the idea that it is ex cathedra. But Did John Paul II know that when he was teaching Ordinatio Sacerdotalis? I'm not sure that he knew that. So I think it's possible, but I think it would be exceptional, right? I think that would be the exception rather than the rule. Ordinarily, a pope knows when they're definitively settling something ex cathedra. But I could envision some cases where they might not fully be aware that they're deciding something ex cathedra. Definitively, yeah, I could see that, as in the case of Ordinatio Sacerdotalis. It just seems odd, though. Like, shouldn't you know that? Oh well. If you're a pope, shouldn't you kind of know when the indicators of papal infallibility are present? You should. Doesn't necessarily mean that you will, though.
In the end, it really just comes across like the Protestants with a Bible in one hand and Strong's Concordance in the other, arguing about which doctrines are key doctrines, based on 19th century word studies of Kinney Greek terms. But again, if a layman has to go around decoding terminology for other laymen because the Magisterium hasn't, is there really genuine doctrinal clarity, or is it simply an eggshell-like facade of clarity? Moving on, Mr. Lofton attempts to take us to task over a supposed lack of unity. This next clip comes from Review, An Orthodox Priest Becomes an Evangelical Pastor, minute marks 30 and 11 seconds to 31 minutes and 43 seconds.
The patriarch
and paper unity sounds like what I've actually coined years ago, and that was the term paper Catholicism, where there's a unity on paper. There's a unity on paper when it comes to the doctrine of the church, but there's definitely division, in practice, feet on the ground. I would still say that unity in Catholicism is objective and is real because it is there's a realness to it, because there are those people who are in communion with the Pope. They're truly in communion with him. So there really is something there. But there is a whole lot of division in Catholicism, even though maybe some of that division shouldn't exist on paper. Practically speaking, with fallen people, there is that division. And one could say that that's what's going on in Orthodoxy as well. But I think the difference, however, is in Catholicism, there is an objective standard on a lot of these issues. And yeah, people may not live up to it, but there is an objective standard. Whereas in Orthodoxy, there isn't an objective standard. It's kind of like in my household, I might have rules for my kids, and they are legitimate rules that everybody knows about. And my kids might not obey the rules, but that doesn't mean the rules don't exist and aren't binding. Whereas you go to the neighbor's house, there aren't those rules actually don't even exist. They're not even there. So it's not the case that people aren't obeying them. It's the case that the people in that household don't even have those rules. That's kind of the difference between Catholicism and Orthodoxy here.
Yet again, Mr. Lofton fails to address how the assent of all the synods to a council or decree is not an objective standard. When all of the synods agree on something as an authentic expression of the Orthodox faith, that, de facto, makes it the position of the Orthodox Church and therefore dogma. Now Mr. Lofton will attempt to claim that Chalcedon did not meet this criteria, but as we discussed earlier, Mr. Lofton's analysis of Chalcedon is patently false, because all of the sees did accept it, and the Oriental sees are not legitimate synods that rejected it, but random synodal members who decided to break off and went on wild ordination sprees to create their own rival synods in the same exact way the so-called true Orthodox have done. In this following clip from the same video, minute marks 32 and 17 seconds through 33 minutes and 55 seconds, Mr. Lofton then cuts off the branch he is sitting on when he makes this oblivious comment about claiming we are effectively helpless when there are rival patriarchs.
Yeah, and I think that when there's some legitimate criticism here with Orthodoxy, and that is criticism towards its concept of unity. What exactly do the Orthodox mean by being united in faith, government, and worship? What exactly does that mean when you don't have a pope
And when you don't have an objective magisterium that is able to definitively settle theological disputes, what does it really mean to speak of unity in faith, government, and worship in that context? I don't see an objective way to answer that. I can give you an objective answer in Catholicism, and I could say that people aren't living up to it in Catholicism, but I can't really answer that one objectively. Now, maybe there are some Orthodox who can, and that's fine. I'd love to have them on the show, send their names my way, and I'd love to interview them and hear their answers. But I'm just saying, having looked into this for years, I don't see a way where the Orthodox can give an objective answer to unity beyond the local level. The answer on the local level is going to be the Eucharist and the bishop, and that's okay. That's fine. That's sufficient. But then when you start asking, well, what happens if you have rival bishops? That's no longer going to work. What happens if you have rival altars? That's no longer going to work, right? So you're going to have some kind of objective standard beyond the local level. And if you even point me to a synod or a patriarch, what happens when you have rival patriarchs and rival synod?
Well, Michael, what happens when you have 3 rival popes? The answer is, you call a council, and the council solves it. That is, after all, how the Western Schism was solved, isn't it? You see here, Mr. Lofton does what he excels at. He gives the Catholic Church a free pass by ignoring how the Catholic Church solved the problem of the 3 rival popes during the Western Schism, but he then utilises his expertise in double standards to criticise us for falling back on the conciliar model to solve an issue as basic as rival patriarchs. As mentioned earlier in this video, that happened in Bulgaria in 1998 when the Ecumenical Patriarch called a pan-Orthodox synod that assembled 2 weeks later and solved it with a unanimous vote. Now it is unlikely that Mr. Lofton was ignoring that last example because he probably did not even know about it. In our following video, we will respond to a number of other assertions Mr. Lofton makes against the Orthodox Church. We want to thank our generous sponsors who have made this video possible through their patronage. It is only through their generosity that this video has been made entirely public. By being a sponsor of ours on Subscribestar and Patreon, you have the exclusive right to message us with questions and have full access to our entire library of material. Further, you furnish us with the financial means to continue to create more videos like this and at a regular pace.